Welcome to The Circle. I'm your host, Paige, and today I have the pleasure of bringing someone on the podcast with a wealth of knowledge and a very focused personal goal of revolutionizing how we look at cropland management and young farmer education. Our guest today, Pete Vegas, is from Louisiana and grew up in a farming community, and he started farming soybeans in high school and in college. He went to Louisiana State University receiving an agricultural degree and then went on to Panama and worked on a banana farm for a couple of years. He then got into and out of Harvard Business School. At this point, he started working for a large rice milling company who sent him to Puerto Rico to start up a farming and milling operation. Eventually, he came back to the States and ran their marketing program, which was mostly export. So he traveled around the world looking at different farms and methods of farming and selling rice. Eventually, he ran that company before starting his own company in the rice ingredient business. Today, they focus on organic frozen rice and are available in almost every grocery store in the country. They're actually the number one item in most of the frozen sections in the natural foods markets. In recent years, Pete has put his energy into exploring regenerative agriculture solutions, focused on how we can grow corn and soybeans, which make up the majority of U.S. cropland, in a way that sequesters carbon and improves farmer livelihood. I'm so excited to have a discussion with Pete today. He's a wealth of knowledge, and he has this crucial focus on regenerating how we manage the majority of U.S. cropland. Welcome, Pete. So, Pete, I wanted to start with your early experience farming. You talked about that you grew up and in high school you farmed soybeans and in college. What did you learn and observe about agriculture that has influenced your perspective today?
I farmed, it was only 160 acres, but back then, you could actually make a living on 400 acres. Today it takes 5,000 acres. But I did everything, no one else set foot on my farm. So I learned a lot about, varieties and farming and different tillage methods. Farming has changed dramatically since then. Um, it's a bit upsetting that they claim these new GMO varieties require less chemicals, but when I look at how many chemicals people are using today, it far exceeds what we used to do. We used to do a lot more tillage, where you were cultivating and moving crops like that. I think this shocking thing that people need to understand is farming is a really tough business today. 50 years ago, when I farmed, I sold soybeans for at least $9 a bushel. One year I sold them for $12 a bushel. Today, soybeans are selling for $10 a bushel. And
Mm.
of course, diesel has gone from 28 cents to $3. So farmers really struggle today. They've got to deal with big acreage. And in the case of regenerative ag, the biggest problem is they can't afford to take risk. They can't afford to try something new that may fail because that could be the end of their whole farming career. So that's the biggest problem with regenerative ag is we've got to show farmers how to make more money farming with less chemicals, and it's difficult for them to take those risks.
Right.
So that's why I have this 250-acre farm that I've started in Louisiana as an experimental farm to take those risks on behalf of the farmer,
Yeah.
to try things that they've never seen before and couldn't afford to try.
Yeah. Before we get to that farm, and I want to talk about it in depth, I want to talk a little bit more about building your companies and about rice. And, one of the things someone could call you the rice king because you've spent so much of your career working on rice cultivation, distribution, product manufacturing. Why did you get into the rice business? Was it coincidence? Was it something about the crop?
I was hired out of Harvard Business School to start a farming and milling operation in Puerto Rico. And I was chosen because I could speak Spanish and because I had a farming background and I have a very much a mechanical background and of course an MBA. So it was, I had no experience with rice before that, even though Louisiana's grows quite a bit of rice and is known for growing rice. So it was more my background that got me into the rice business, and I really have been in it one way or the other since 1982.
And a lot of people don't necessarily associate rice with a sustainable or environmentally friendly way of farming because we associate it with flood farming, right?
Right.
Flooding fields, it uses a lot of water. Is that necessary? And what advancements or what have you worked on in your own business to change this practice?
In most of the world, rice is grown in flooded fields. And there's a misconception that rice is an aquatic plant and has to be grown in a flooded field. That is not true. Rice is grown in flooded fields for weed protections. There aren't many plants that will grow in a flooded field, and rice will.
Mm.
Imagine if you grew it without water, how you would keep grass out of it. I mean, rice is basically a grass. So it's challenging, but it's done in underdeveloped countries where they can afford to weed by hand. It's become a big movement in the state of Arkansas. It's called row crop farming. It's really taking over in Arkansas because it's say they lose a little bit in yields, but it saves them money. They don't because in Arkansas they have to rotate between corn and between soybeans and rice. It's almost a requirement because of the chemical applications that they have. So when you go from one to the other, it's expensive, repulling levees, setting up water systems. So people are starting to realize it works. I can show you a picture. I brought a farmer from California and showed him what they were doing in Arkansas, and he was growing tomatoes in California on tape irrigation, where you're running tape on, like 8 to 10 to 12 inches under the ground. And he planted a crop of rice on that, and it's beautiful. And of course, my interest in that, I mean, if you can pull this up, that's what his crop looked like when it was in the green state. This is what it looked like when it was in the harvest state. My interest at the time was we had 2 years of drought in California, and it's pretty clear those conditions are going to happen again. And that particular year, no rice whatsoever was grown on the west side of the Sacramento River because they did not have enough water. So water supplies, are becoming a big problem, especially in the state of California. And so switching to dry crop rice, is needed. And in my area of interest in regenerative ag, you cannot really be regenerative if you're growing in a flooded field. You can't grow a cover crop and you can't leave that cover crop. If you have remains of a crop in a flooded field, you get all kind of algae problems and it'll basically ruin your rice crop. But if it was farmed dry, you could have a cover crop, you could leave that cover crop, you could plant the rice into the cover crop. So that's a big challenge. Rice is probably the most challenging product to grow regeneratively. And of course, the other big issue, which you don't hear a lot about, but you will with time, is when rice is grown in a flooded field, the residue from the remaining crop is digested anaerobically, which means methane is coming off those fields. And methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon, than CO2. So
Wow. It seems like you started and spent most of your career with a crop that's one of the hardest to do regeneratively. How did that influence like your learnings of regenerative? And really, I mean, we've talked a little bit about how you've traveled throughout the country, you've looked at different farms, you've looked at different practices. What have you seen be the most successful, and what are the things that people talk about a lot that just don't work, that just aren't practical?
okay, so when you look at the big picture and you're really trying to move the world into regenerative ag, and of course, the reason you're doing that are things like climate change. We're using too much water. We're putting out too many chemicals. There you've got to focus on the most important crop opportunities or opportunities to move carbon. So if you look at this slide, half the farm, they call it farmland. I don't call everything farmland, but half of it is grazing land, okay? And you hear a lot about regenerative agriculture with livestock, which quite frankly, that type of soil hasn't lost that much carbon and can't pull that much carbon back in. You hear a lot about it because it's easy to do. These new methods that, were originally, Alan Savory was the guy that brought it to everyone's attention, where you're moving cattle through paddocks in big herds. It actually works, and it's pretty easy to move into it, and it pays off pretty quickly. But in terms of solving the big problem, that's not where the opportunity is. So now what you're looking at is how much of crop, half of that, say 400,000 acres or more, is in cropland. And what I'm telling you here is, like rice is barely a blip on that. It's, we're a country that grows corn and soybeans. And unfortunately, none of it goes for human consumption. Corn, soybeans, hay, a lot of these other things are strictly going into cattle or ethanol. And that's why all these moves to get the consumer to understand regenerative ag and buy more, that's not going to pay off either, because most of the farmland, which has really been disturbed and released all this carbon, is in the big crops, the corn, the soybean, wheat. So that's the areas that we need to focus on, and that's why you don't see me spending a lot of time on rice.
It makes a ton of sense. And if there isn't that consumer element, what is going to be motivating these farmers that are doing large swaths of corn and soybean, and they're heavily spraying pesticide and herbicide? What's going to motivate them to make this transition?
So this is when I get in big groups and these discussions get into this, in my opinion, they all get off track. They talk about trying to convince the consumer to pay more. They talk about carbon credit. They talk about government subsidies. Now, government subsidies could have an impact. In my opinion, the solution is teaching farmers how to farm regeneratively in a way where they actually make more money. Okay, for this, for my project in Louisiana, I asked my friends, I got information from LSU on a budget, and I was shocked that half of the budgets to grow soybeans, where you're not even using fertilizers, okay? We're just talking chemicals, insecticides, pesticides. Half of the cost were in these inputs. So if you literally got half the yield, you would do just as well. So the key is, and I'm not obsessed with eliminating chemicals, because at the beginning you would probably go broke if you did that. You have to transition into it. But the idea is, can you cut these chemicals to 20% of what you were using and get an 85, 90% yield and make more money? And I clearly believe you can. And there are farmers absolutely doing that. The problem is not many farmers are aware of these methods, and they're afraid to try them because it's such a risk involved. So I think that's what it's about. It's about education. We don't teach regenerative farming in any of the universities today. Okay. None of these universities are, farmers learn from experimental stations. The one I'm familiar with is Louisiana State University. They have 17 experimental stations throughout the state where they're testing different methods, unfortunately, mostly chemical applications, because that's where their funding comes from. But that's where farmers go to learn. And right now, they're not seeing this in research stations. They're not coming out of school with agronomy degrees and having studied this. So to me, that's where the opportunities are. We have to teach the farmers to do this in a way that makes money.
Definitely. And you'd mentioned universities, and I know you're doing work with a number of universities that I want to get into. But first, can you help people to understand the corruption that's happening at the university level with large chemical agribusiness, and what they're doing to teach the next generation of farmers?
Well, unfortunately, universities are run like businesses. They have to make money or pay their budgets, and unfortunately, schools like LSU don't get that much money from their football program, where all the money is. And if you look at I'm not sure demographics is the right word, but the population of incoming students, that particular age group is going down. So universities are really worried about staying in business. And when it comes to research farms, basically almost all their outside money comes from the big, Syngentas and Monsantos and the people that are paying them to test chemicals. So if you go to their research farms, that's what they're studying. New varieties of seeds, which are always resistant to some chemical, along with those chemical applications. Um, a lot of people tell me I'm crazy trying to move this into the universities because they're going to cut me off because they can't afford to do this. They can't afford to teach farmers to grow without spending money on chemicals. So I don't know how that's going to play out. We'll find out as I get deeper into it. I'm hoping to I've actually got presentations coming up this week at 2 universities. I hope to do more of those and see if I can at least get a regenerative ag 101 course, in and at least get one or two of their research farms testing regenerative practices. So that's a tough one, and I don't know how that's going to play out.
Yeah. It's interesting when you look at a lot of the money flows that's coming into regenerative agriculture as a whole, and you look at where people are investing, where the philanthropic dollars are going, where the venture dollars are going, the angel dollars. I see a lot of focus on ag tech startups. I also see a lot of focus on consumer brands, which we've already touched on. I've never actually heard about focus on universities. Are you seeing anything different, or how do you think general funding for both philanthropic and investment dollars needs to be reallocated within the industry?
I'm not sure there's much philanthropic money at all. I'm not seeing it. Some of the biggest players in that area frustrate me. Bill Gates, perfect example, and I don't have a problem calling him out. He owns over 200,000 acres. I've been on almost all of his property because in Louisiana and Arkansas, one of his biggest farms touches my family farm. They're tenant farmed, most of them. They have 1-year contracts, no incentive to improve anything. And the owner, Gates Foundation, is not encouraging them to do regenerative farming. So I'm not seeing a lot of philanthropic money. And unfortunately, yes, you're seeing people, new tech, a lot of can we grow bacteria that helps? Can we grow fungi that helps? Can we, inoculate seeds? You're seeing a lot of that, but I haven't seen much success come out of that. My point being, there's really no way to make money in this space, or not a lot of ways other than being the farmer. There's a huge chemical industry, seed industry to feed farming. But when you talk about using less of all that stuff, there's not a big opportunity in the private sector to push these practices.
Mm.
If anything, you have the opposite going on. You've got these big companies scared to death you're going to take away their income. So to me, the real opportunity, the best opportunity, is through teaching farmers how to do it and make money. It requires a lot less equipment, but different equipment. Okay. And so like this farm that I've put up, we had to buy a roller crimper. We had to buy a special no-till drill to drill the cover crop. And then we had to modify a planter to be able to plant in a lot of biomass like that. Those are not expensive, way cheaper than what they're using now, but it's different and it costs money. And then they're afraid they're going to try something. One of the most interesting things happening in regenerative farming, and you're seeing a lot of it up further north, is people are planting soybeans into standing rye. So rye that's like 3 feet tall, they're planting soybeans in it. 2 weeks later, when the soybeans are at what they call the V2 or V3 stage, where they're like 6 or 8 inches tall, they come in with a roller crimper and they knock all this rye down. And that scares the hell out of people. Are those soybeans going to come back up? You know, you're going to kill your soybeans. They do come back up, but until
Mm-hmm.
you've seen it and done it yourself, you're not going to try that and lose a crop and go broke. You know, so that's what's missing, or demonstration farms where people can actually firsthand see that this stuff works. And that's what I don't see out there. That's what's missing. And that could come through the university systems.
It makes so much sense. And it's, right now the resources just aren't available. And so it's this leap of faith. Like, what's a farmer going to do? Start YouTube videoing it and then risk their whole, their whole family business and their livelihood. And so it seems like it's, education and showing them that you can de-risk the process. Do you think that there's a role for transition financing, like both for the equipment and, what are you seeing in these traditional row crops in terms of how many years it takes to transition and get your yield up and make more money, get your profit margins up? What does that transition timing look like?
You know, I wish I could tell you because I don't know for sure. My guess is it's probably 3 years. Now that doesn't mean you lose money at the beginning, but you make less money and you're taking risk. You know, several things have to happen. For one thing, you have to build up your microbiome in order to digest these cover crops. Because when you're first starting out, your soil is kind of dead. You know, I mean, if you dig in and you don't find worms, that means there's nothing to eat. The microbiome needs to be fed. So it takes a few years to build up a healthy microbiome that can really digest this biomass that you're putting into it. When you first start off, you're going to have weed problems, but as you can build a heavier biomass on the soil, like a mat, you know, like this picture right here, if I can figure out how to get that one up. You see how thick the mat is
Yeah.
that that corn was planted into? When you can achieve that, you're reducing weed pressure and you're cutting the chemicals on weeds. And it takes time for beneficial insects to build up so that you're not having to kill the insects that are causing trouble. So I wish I knew, and I think it changes depending on the location. You know, where we're going to try things in Louisiana is the most challenging because it's humid and there means more weed pressure, more insect pressure. Um, but ideally, we want to come up with kind of a 3-year transition for system, and where you're not losing money during those 3 years. It's not like organic, where you have to put your crop idle for 3 years, where you really lose some money transitioning. Um, but I can't answer those questions for sure. That's one reason we've started this farm so we can learn ourselves. I don't want to push something that I haven't seen firsthand work, you know. Um,
So tell me more about Fells Farm. Tell me about the location, about the practices you guys are working on, about the aim, about why you're doing this.
So, so this was, my family owns some farm in Louisiana, farmland. I rented from them this 250-acre farm, which is right on a major highway where all the farmers go by. There's no trees in front of it, so you can absolutely see what we're doing. I have a nephew because I live in Colorado. I run a big company. I don't have time to be trying to farm 250 acres. But I have a nephew that is a Mississippi State grad who's a crop consultant who's really into this stuff and really excited to learn about it. So he's farming it for me. So people can drive by and just scan that and go to our site. And on the site, we're really explaining, what we're doing. So we've broken the property into 5 different plots. 3 are soybeans, 2 are corn. Each plot has a different set of cover crops on it. We tried growing 2 types of cover. When you plant a cover crop, we mix the seeds. So some of it would grow as if a summer crop and kill in the winter. I call that a winter kill. And then the other ones would grow, slow down during the winter, take off in the spring. That's your normal cover crop. And that's what I call spring kill. So we tried a bunch of different seeds. In particular, the grasses that we're using will hit maturity at different stages. You have to be really careful when you terminate these things. You've got to catch them before, after they flower, but before seeds develop, because you don't want those seeds going into your crop. So we're trying Merced Spring rye. We're trying a normal standard type of rye. We're trying black oats. Then we're going to try different planting procedures. We're going to plant into standing rye, like I described with the soybeans. Some of them we're going to chemically terminate. Others we're going to try mechanically terminating, and to see if the weeds really come back strong. And if they do, we'll spray them later. So that's and we're putting all this on the website so farmers can drive by, look at it. I mean, and tell me, I can tell you they are shocked at what they're seeing, because I drove through that area 2 weeks ago, and it's plowed bare land for miles and miles until you hit our farm. And it's green. And today it's probably 2 feet high. And by the time we start doing things, it's going to be maybe 4 feet high. And that's just going to, people have never seen anything like that in that
Mm.
area for sure. And I've told them they can walk on the property, they can have a look, they can do what they want, they can ask questions. Um, so that's what's going on with that farm.
What's really interesting about this is I think um, there's a lot of great marketing people behind regenerative and behind the consumer brands. And I think, this perception for some people, especially in California and liberal areas on the coast that are shopping at Whole Foods, that there's this whole regenerative movement and there's a ton of farmland where that's happening. And that might be the case on much smaller farms. But what you've really illuminated today is that for the majority of the farmland across the country, we're still seeing barren land. And most of these farmers just have no idea that this is even happening or that this is an option. And every year they're asked to spray more and more chemicals, seed gets more expensive, and their margin gets smaller. Is that is that really the world that you're seeing? Because I think it's very different from what a lot of people imagine is happening.
Unless things have changed in the last year or two, less than 5% of farmed cropland in the United States has cover crops. Okay. And I don't see them. And I drive all over the place. Um, you see more of it in California. They're trying to do some things in California, but no, these are still, this whole thing is still in the fringe. There aren't many farmers doing it, and to be done properly, they've got to be the big scale farmers. I don't know of more than two or three that are farming 5,000 acres, which is kind of what you have to farm today to really be in business regeneratively. Um, so no, people are getting excited about it, and there's clearly a movement, and it's getting better, but it's tiny compared to what needs to be done. There, and some of the marketing things I find annoying. There's a rice company in California that claims regenerative because they plant two different types of cover crops, but then they plow them under. So I've stated, obviously we're in the business of selling food products, and our products are mostly organic, but I've avoided any marketing claims, because I just, it hasn't gone far enough, and a lot of them are not legit, and people
Yeah.
don't really understand what true regenerative is.
Yeah. And it seems like your definition of regenerative is really about the farmer and increasing farmers' wages and farmer health and farmer livelihood. And um, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with a consumer or a claim or a label.
If they can make money, they don't need those other things. If those other things come and they can make more money, that's great. But I think if we wait and expect those things to make the changes, we're losing time. The biggest opportunity is if they can make money. They all understand environmental issues more than people realize, because they live it every day, and they understand soil health. They understand that their soil doesn't hold water like it used to, that it doesn't have organic matter like it used to. So they would move toward these practices if they knew they could make money.
As we wrap up here, I want to understand from your perspective, you've named some of the biggest challenges. Can you just lay them out for us? Like, what are the biggest challenges to us transitioning? And really, how is one man going to go about combating that at the universities? What type of team do you need to pull forth to make sure that these universities start teaching about this?
That's a good question. I mean, and my first step is to make sure that I know what I'm talking about. I'm giving presentations soon to see what kind of reaction I get from educators and from students to see if we get a good reaction. As I transfer out of my business, I'm hoping to spend some more money myself on these. It doesn't cost that much, to create a regenerative ag 101 program that can be taught in universities doesn't cost that much. The farm that I have in Louisiana, 250 acres, I expect to make money off of it. Okay. And if I do lose money, it's going to be $20,000 maybe. So how much does it really cost to do these things? I was funding some university research plots at LSU. It was costing $25,000 a year. So I would hope one day to have my own foundation. If other people want to contribute to that, that would be great. If I could talk other foundations to getting involved in this. I'm not here to make money managing a foundation. I'm willing to spend my own money. And so, it's a challenge, but my focus, and I think what's missing and the biggest opportunity are with the universities. And that's where my entire focus will be. Trying to convince them to put it in their research plots and to teach it. Other people can focus on how do we classify it? Do we put a logo on it? How do we get government subsidies? Those are not the things I'm best at. So I'll let other people go that direction.
Yeah.
All of it helps. It's all good stuff.
Yeah.
I'm just focusing on the area where I think I can contribute and I think is really the most important.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for the work that you're doing in this space and for dedicating your time, money, and energy to it. I'm really excited to see how Fells Farm goes, and we'll include the link to the website. And thank you so much, Pete, for sharing your perspectives today. Thanks for joining us today. If you have a chance to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, it helps us so much. Thanks for tuning in today. Until next time, welcome to the circle.